my speculation would be that they would like to have it over with before the presidential campaign. The problem is that when you're in a war, you don't know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, the chances are it'll be a pushover. It ought to be. I mean, there's no Iraqi army. You know, the country will probably collapse in 2 minutes, you know. But you can't be sure of that. And in fact, if you take the CIA warning seriously, they're pretty straight about it. I'm sure it was published here. You know, I mean, they're saying, you know, if there's a war, Iraq may respond by terrorist acts. And what could those terrorist acts be? Well, they could be pretty serious. I mean, years ago there were technical studies circulating saying that it wouldn't take that much competence to put together a nuclear bomb and a dirty bomb in the New York hotel room. You smuggle the parts across the Canadian border, which is totally porous. You know, I could smuggle things across the Canadian border. There's no way of barring it. And it's not a big deal. There's loose nukes around in Russia and Pakistan, you know, all over the place. Any dedicated group of people could be doing that. And the government studies estimated before 9/11, you know, a couple of years before September 11th, that the probability of success for a well-planned operation to put a nuclear bomb in, say, a New York hotel room would be about 90%, way higher than any missile attack. And in fact, MIT Press published a technical study about 4 years ago by 3 so-called, you know, strategic analyst types, which is like a guidebook to terrorists. It's called America's Achilles Heel, if you want to take a look at it. It came out around 1998. And it's just a, you know, kind of a list of possible terrorist actions that you could carry out and how you could do it. And it's mostly pretty simple, you know, like wouldn't take much. So it's possible that they're in place. And, you know, like international relations guys like Kenneth Waltz, for example, have been pointing out that U.S. adventurism is just driving countries into developing weapons of mass destruction and terrorism as a deterrent. They don't have any other deterrent. You know, conventional forces don't work, obviously. And there's no external deterrent, so these guys are just free to do what they want. And the only way anyone can defend themselves is terror and weapons of mass destruction. So it's plausible to assume that they're doing it. I suppose that's the basis for the CIA analyses. I doubt that they have any intelligence, but, and I suppose British intelligence is saying the same thing. They probably are. So yeah, that, you know, those could be consequences. But you don't want to have that happen in the middle of a presidential campaign. You want it to be done, you know, and you want the war to be over. There is the problem about what to do with the effects of the war, but that's easy. You count on journalists and intellectuals not to talk about it. So how many people are talking about Afghanistan? You know, Afghanistan's sort of back where it was, you know, run by warlords and gangsters, and you know, women are about where they were before. I mean, you know, I just met Christina Lamb a little while ago, and it just happens by accident. A couple of days ago, I was reading articles of hers from the 80s. She was in Kabul around 1989. We talked about it a little. But her description of Kabul in 1989 looks like paradise as compared with what it is now. I mean, at the university, women are running around with, you know, mini skirts and smoking cigarettes and doing anything they feel like. And, you know, it was by comparison, not the rest of the country, but, you know, but the rest of the country now is the same as it was under the Taliban pretty much. But in Kabul, it hasn't gotten back to what it was in 1989. Actually, the head of the UN has had there's a very Indian woman, Rasul Basu, who was the head of women's affairs for the UN back in the 70s and the 80s. She's a well-known lawyer, Yale Law School graduate, and that sort of thing. She was writing in the late 80s she was in Afghanistan as the UN officer for women's affairs or some such thing. And through the late 80s, she was writing articles about how if the people the Americans are organizing take over, it's going to be a complete disaster, especially for women, but for everybody else. And you know, even the feminist magazines wouldn't publish her articles. Like Ms. in the United States wouldn't, or The Nation or anybody wouldn't publish what she was saying because it's the wrong story, and they're still not saying it. But if you take a look at Afghanistan now, who's writing about it? I mean, almost nobody. You know, so if it goes back to what it was, who cares? Everyone's forgotten about it. And if Iraq turns into, let's say people slaughtering each other, I can write the articles right now. Backward peoples. I mean, we tried to save them. But all they can do is murder each other because they're, dirty Arabs and that sort of thing. But you have to have it over. So, and by then, I presume, I'm just guessing, that they'll be on to the next one, which will probably be either Syria or Iran. In fact, the war with Iran is probably already underway. According to, again, there's not a lot of evidence, but if you look at American scholarly sources, they're claiming, I don't know, they don't give a lot of evidence, that like Robert Olson, who's the main American academic specialist on the region, had an article over the summer in which he claims, it's known that about 12% of the Israeli Air Force and armored forces are in southeastern Turkey, presumably at the American military bases. And according to him, they're there because they're preparing for the war against Iran. They don't care about Iraq. Iraq, they figure, is a pushover. But Iran has always been a problem for Israel. It's the one country in the region that they can't handle. And they've been after the U.S. to take it on for them for years. And according to this report, the Israeli Air Force is now flying at the Iranian border as part of intelligence and provocation and so on. And it's not a small Air Force. It's bigger than the British Air Force, for example, and more advanced. It's, in fact, bigger, bigger than any NATO power outside the U.S. And so it's probably underway. He claims that there are efforts to stir up Azeri separatism in the north, which, makes some sense. It's Azeri territory. It's what the Russians tried to do in 1946, was to pull it off and that would separate Iran, or what's left of Iran, from the Caspian oil-producing centers. And then you could hope to partition it or something or other. So probably that'll be underway at the time. And then there'll be a story about how Iran's going to kill us tomorrow unless we get rid of them today and that sort of thing. At least that's been the pattern, so I don't see any reason to. So this guy might be right, but I'd guess that it's probably over the winter.